Good morning. Thank you for inviting me back to speak with you today. Today's talk is my attempt to work through something I've not entirely figured out. In many ways, I'm not sure anyone has. But every now and then, there are words and lives that help us along the way. Whitman and Dickinson are two poets whose work I often turn to when things seem difficult. The subtitle of my talk, I use the phrase life during calamity. So let me start by defining what I mean by calamity. As you may know, I spent last year in Norway, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that I relished. There's much to discuss. Honestly, I could talk about it until you never want to hear from me or even hear anything about Norway ever again. But one thing that is interesting to me was the experience of leaving the immediacy of American political problems and social unrest and seeing it from afar. It is very clarifying. My stay in Norway, again, I can talk about that at greater length, but I'm speaking right now about the personal experience of having an ocean that lies between me and the school shootings, police brutality, bad faith politics, the propaganda, economic inequality, the creeping authoritarianism, and natural disasters, all happening while algorithms magnetize our eyes to glowing screens and vibrating boxes that feed us the very worst of what we desire as we're overfed and malnourished, a country that from the outside looks like it's on fire. I ran that last bit by someone I know, and they said, maybe you could open with something a little less depressing. Isn't the theme supposed to be wintering? It is, but I'm trying to set up the problem in its starkest terms. So being away was very good for my health, but then I came back. And since then, I've been struggling to balance my concerns for activism, agitating for social change, systemic change, not to mention worrying about the future my son will face, with enjoying my family, leading a fulfilling life, to, in the words of Henry David Thoreau, live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. Now, Thoreau, for his part, made his hermitage to Walden Pond in the context of a career fighting injustice, vocally and effectively, even if his mom did his laundry well into adulthood, as my wife likes to point out. So I want to say that this talk is not about escaping in times of social, political, and ecological unrest, in the hopes of retreating away from the worst effects of what's happening during our times. It's in the broader context of all of us doing whatever we can to make things better, whether it's striking, protesting, or in the case of these writers, creating. So today we'll look at two poets who lived through times that were perhaps as bleak as ours. In fact, I would say not perhaps. And where I want to explore how they managed to find humanity amidst the ashes. I want to start with a phrenological reading. Are people familiar with phrenology? This 19th century phenomenon where you would read people's character traits by checking on the bumps in their scalps. There was a whole science about it, and it was actually much of it very racist. Walt Whitman had a reading in 1849, and this is what it was the result. Size of head, large, so he and I have that in common. Leading traits appear to be friendship, sympathy, sublimity, and self-esteem, and markedly among his combinations, the dangerous faults of indolence, a tendency to the pleasures of voluptuousness and alimentiveness appetite, and a certain reckless swing of animal will. Quite a remarkable reading from checking the bumps. I'm sure that it's just a coincidence that the person doing the reading was his friend and knew him well. But in 1855, everything seemed pretty tenuous. The Kansas-Nebraska Act from the year before led to outbreaks of violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the West as the country was marching steadily towards war. Slavery in the South, race riots in the North, wars with Native Americans, injustices against women, and so much more were lurking behind all of the innovations, technological progress, and even social progress happening, just like today, where there are reasons to be optimistic about the future, including essentially the young people who seem eager and ready to tackle the problems we've ignored or exacerbated and tackle them in ways we probably can't even envision right now. Well, I'm supposed to be pessimistic at this point in the talk. I'm going to work on that. But overall, 1855, like today, was an uncertain time where the problems facing individuals seemed overwhelming. And with the hindsight of history, we know that they were about to get worse. Nevertheless, Whitman opened his famous 1855 collection of poems called Leaves of Grass with the lines, "I celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." In the context of what I mentioned above, there are a couple of things I should mention. First, Whitman was no blind optimist. And this lengthy poem includes references to violence, war, death, an enslaved man hiding from slave catchers, and the poet himself sort of helping him, imagining himself helping someone. But those opening lines underpin all of the people, places, experiences he lists in exhaustive fashion throughout the poem. What I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. It is an American poem, a democratic poem, the many parts bleeding into one, and a philosophical poem with flexible sense of the self that includes the other and the universe itself. In the midst of national turmoil and incredible uncertainty, Whitman was able to put forward a poetic vision that somehow incorporated the calamities of his day while still retaining hope. But what happens to someone like that when he sees the horrors of war? Whitman's case was interesting. As he would admit in the poem I'm going to talk about briefly next, he found himself getting caught up in the excitement of the war drums leading into the Civil War. But by 1862, it had become clear to everyone that the war was not going to end after a couple of battles. And this became more concrete for Whitman when his brother was wounded at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. Whitman left his mom's house and headed to Washington, D.C. to find his brother. To Whitman's great relief, his brother had merely been scraped in the jaw by shrapnel. George Washington Whitman would be fine. Walt, however, was permanently changed. Specifically, he decided he would stay and nurse the wounded. In Whitman's words, aroused and angry, I'd thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war. But soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them or silently watch the dead. As a nurse, it appears that Whitman was beloved by many soldiers. D. Willard Bliss, the superintendent of Armory Square Hospital, wrote the following about Whitman. From my personal knowledge of Mr. Whitman's labors in Armory Square and other hospitals, I am of the opinion that no one person who assisted in the hospitals during the war accomplished so much good to the soldier and for the government as Mr. Whitman. On the other hand, it seems like the nurses didn't really like him. Harriet Foote Hawley wrote to her husband, quote, "There comes that odious Walt Whitman to talk evil and unbelief to my boys. I think I would rather see the evil one himself. I shall get him out as soon as possible." Now, there are a number of reasons she might say this. Walt Whitman's work was scandalous, it was very unchristian for the time, but also there might have been a strain of homophobia in there, as Walt Whitman was gay, but also this, people were sometimes not comfortable with sort of the kind of same-sex attachment that Whitman would show. And these quotations, by the way, are from an article by Martin G. Murray, who did some good work on Whitman during the Civil War. But for the poet and the human being, I think that Whitman's time nursing the wounded enlivened and enriched him. Certainly, there's a more somber strain in his poetry, though. And while he shares his cosmic vision of intertwined destinies and commingled souls, in his poem, The Wound Dresser, which I just quoted from above, it's less of a stated manifesto, like it was in Song of Myself, and more of an implied answer to a question. What saw you to tell us? What stays with you latest and deepest? Of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements, or sieges tremendous? What deepest remains? I would argue that what deepest remains is the sympathy informing and vitalizing Whitman in times of terrible calamity. In a notebook entry from the time, Whitman wrote, quote, "Sometimes there come to one's or a man's or woman's heart and fill him or her from head to foot such waves, floods of," and then he crosses out a number of words, abstract, no, mortal, no, sympathy, no, such waves, floods of love for our humankind. Jane Bennett tracked that down in her article. Now, some people sometimes can be like this. The way to heal and nourish our own soul when the world appears to be crumbling around us, when the world seems like it's on fire, is to reach out and heal others, to connect and find our common humanity. This can pull us out of our deepest caverns of despair and self-doubt, to find what deepest remains. But sometimes, some people cannot be like this. The outside world is overwhelming, bewildering, and draining. It certainly was that way for large portions of Emily Dickinson's life. Now, Dickinson is often set up as the polar opposite of Walt Whitman. Whitman as the public bard sounding his barbaric yops across the American landscape. Dickinson as the reclusive New England nun, who did once say of Walt Whitman, quote, "I never read his book, but was told that it was disgraceful." She was certainly more reclusive than Whitman, but how much she actually lived up to the myth is open to debate. Mabel Loomis Todd, who knew her by being her brother's mistress, and then future editor, it's a whole thing, described her this way: Emily is called in Amherst the myth. She is, she's writing this in 1882, so just know this is not much later. Emily is called in Amherst the myth. She has not been out of the house for 15 years. She writes the strangest poems, very remarkable ones. She's in many respects a genius. She wears always white and has her hair arranged as was the fashion 15 years ago when she went into retirement. That's quoted by Betsy Erkula. We also have another account by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a man who fought in the Civil War and was also an editor and had correspondence with Emily Dickinson. He paid her a visit after they'd been exchanging letters in 1870. And he describes the encounter this way: after a little delay, I heard an extremely, again, by the way, keep in mind, this is a grown woman. Like she's I think by this time, she's almost 40. After a little delay, I heard an extremely faint and pattering footstep like that of a child in the hall, and in glided, almost noiselessly, a plain, shy little person, the face without a single good feature, but with eyes, as she herself said. Of course, he feels comfortable critiquing her appearance, like the eyes like the sherry the guest leaves in the glass, and with smooth bands of reddish chestnut hair. She had a quaint and nun-like look, as if she might be a German canoness of some religious order. She came toward me with 2 daylilies, which she put in a childlike way into my hand, saying softly under her breath, "These are my introduction," and adding, also under her breath in childlike fashion, "Forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what to say." She went on talking constantly and saying in the midst of narrative things quaint and aphoristic. Is it oblivion or absorption when things pass from our minds? Truth is such a rare thing. It is delightful to tell it. How do most people live without any thoughts? Or this crowning extravaganza: if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I physically feel as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? And he closes the account by saying, "I never was with anyone who drained my nerve power so much. Without touching me, she drew from me. I'm glad not to live near her." Of course, Dickinson and Whitman are both more complex and dynamic than their historical stereotypes. But just as Whitman's poetry offers a blueprint for the need to reach out, Dickinson provides a path that is more introspective, the path of digging down, much more akin to wintering, as Catherine May seems to describe it. Perhaps a comparison between 2 poems about something similar, like, say, spiders making webs, will help me get at these 2 approaches. So let's look at these 2 poems about spiders. The first one is by Whitman, and Taylor, are you able to get the Whitman poem up? Thank you. I threw this at them this morning. So this, it's a noiseless patient spider is the excellent. So this is from Whitman. A noiseless patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. Whitman's spider, though noiseless and patient, is overflowing with filament, inexhaustible, and yet frenetically, desperately reaching outward, trying to connect. The soul, too, appears to be inexhaustible. And this shows up in so much of Whitman's poetry, where there's so much repetition, so many, it seems like coming as though it's overflowing from the overabundance of the self. But it requires connection, an anchor and a bridge to somewhere or someone external to it. Can we go to the next one? Thank you. And now this is a poem about spiders from Emily Dickinson. And I think you should know that my hatred of spiders is something I had to overcome to even entertain this comparison. A spider sewed at night, without a light, upon an ark of white. If rough it was of dame or shroud of gnome, himself in form. Of immortality, his strategy was physiognomy. Now, Dickinson's spider, by comparison, is more self-contained, and you also see this, of course, in the length of the lines themselves. It's not clear what his design is. Rough if it was of dame or shroud of gnome, but he seems to keep it to himself in form. And I love that she uses the word inform here. Inform, inward, informing. Again, these are, she had such an attention to diction and all of the connotations of words. But this is a very different spider. It is through the private display of artistic brilliance, rather than reaching out to somewhere else, that he's able to achieve immortality, alone, in the dark. A year after Whitman's brother was wounded at Fredericksburg, Dickinson would write, and this is not in response, I'm just giving you a time frame here. The soul's superior instants occur to her alone, when friend and earth's occasion have infinite withdrawn. It's when we are alone, the poet seems to say, that we can finally look within and see the inner resources that seemed so inexhaustible to Whitman. And in some ways, there's a conflict, that the reaching out that sustains Whitman's view of the soul is a barrier to Dickinson's view of the soul. This is a conflict. She writes later that year, exhilaration is within. There can no outer wine so royally intoxicate as that diviner brand. Now, solitude is not only necessary for repairing our wounds, but in Dickinson's poetry, it is also a source of true joy. Biographers seem to think that this reflects her lived experience. Betsy Erkela writes, quote, Dickinson was not the innocent, lovelorn, emotionally fragile girl sentimentalized by the Dickinson myth. Her decision to shut the door on Amherst society in the late 1850s transformed her house into a kind of magical realm in which she was free to engage her poetic genius. It sounds a bit like the wintering we've been discussing, yeah? She continues, her seclusion was a part of a more general pattern of renunciation through which she, in her quest for self-sovereignty, carried on an argument with the Puritan fathers, attacking with wit and irony their cheerless Calvinist doctrine, their stern patriarchal God, and their rigid notions of true womanhood. In this way, we could view Dickinson's seclusion both as an act of survival and as an act of radical resistance, a rejection of the stifling patriarchal Puritanism of the day, an affirmation of a woman's soul, and a refusal to allow the currents of the day to drown her. So, as the nation was tearing itself apart at the seams, Dickinson retreated inward. From what we can tell, she did stay abreast of the news going on, but she generally stayed at home. Her way of processing the chaos of her time was to look inward, to seek her own genius, and quietly immortalize it in her own voice. This is one way of living during a time of calamity. Whitman's response, at least as we've looked at it today, was to seek connections, to dive into involvement with others, to use sympathy as a vitalizing force and flourish by means of human interactions. This is another way of living during a time of calamity. Now, of course, there were times when Dickinson was social, especially by mail. Now, but today, in today's terms, she would much prefer a text than a phone call. And there were also times when Whitman went on long walks by himself, right? And there are many ways to live, definitely more than two. But here's what I've learned from these two poets, among other things. First, that these can represent different seasons within our own life. This year, we may desperately need to cling to each other, to seek out connections, and next year, we may need to retreat and turn inward in order to heal and to grow. In the meantime, we may be at odds with ourselves and others as these competing needs arise. But I'm not trying to say that this is I'm not trying to say this is necessarily a question of disposition. Some people are like this, other people are like this, although that may be true to an extent. Rather, it's a question of finding what works for us at different times, what nourishes our soul or self, so that it can engage and shape the world into something more nourishing for ourselves and others, and so on. It's a bit optimistic, right? And second, there are a lot of things that these two approaches have in common. For one thing, they both require sympathy for others, for ourselves. They both require attention, the slow, focused, prolonged attention that is so difficult for so many today, myself especially. And then both poets, it's extremely important to them to have an experience of the natural world of some kind. Regardless, knowing that these poets were able to map out paths for the soul during times of immense devastation gives me hope that we can do the same, that we can find what deepest remains in ourselves and in each other. Thank you for your time.